Meet Margaret Whitfield, a 72-year-old widow living quietly in the suburbs of Boston. To the outside world, she appears modest and unassuming, the kind of elderly woman who might be overlooked at family gatherings or seated behind the flowers at her daughter's wedding. But behind her silver hair and gentle smile lies a lifetime of resilience, wisdom, and a determination that refuses to fade with age. Margaret's story begins when her charming new son-in-law tries to take advantage of her vulnerability, unaware that she carries both the memory of her late husband's strength and the resources to fight back. What follows is a journey from isolation to empowerment, from being underestimated to becoming a protector not only for herself, but for countless other seniors. This is the spirit of Grandma's Final Chapter, a channel dedicated to telling powerful, emotional stories about older adults who defy stereotypes and reclaim their independence. We believe aging is not about fading away, but about living fully, with dignity and courage. If Margaret's journey inspires you, let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Like this video to support stories that give a voice to seniors. Subscribe today and join us for new, meaningful stories every day. Stories that remind us all that later life can be the most powerful chapter of all. The bells of St. Andrew's Church rang with a clarity that seemed to reach into every street of Boston's Old Quarter. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, scattering patches of red, blue, and gold across the stone floor. Guests whispered, hats rustled, heels clicked. Everyone looked radiant, expectant, eager to celebrate. Everyone, it seemed, except for the 72-year-old widow who had been quietly escorted to the edge of the reception hall and placed behind a towering wall of white lilies and roses. Margaret Whitfield adjusted her shawl and stared at the floral arrangement that blocked her view like a curtain. It was so large that she might as well have been sitting in another room. She could hear the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the orchestra tuning, but she could see nothing except petals and stems. The card at her table said, Table 14, a number that meant little until she realized it was at the farthest corner, a place usually reserved for distant cousins or acquaintances who barely knew the family. Her daughter Claire was the bride. Her only child, walking down the aisle in Harold's family lace gown, a piece of history that Margaret had guarded for half a century. Margaret had ironed it herself, touching each fold with care, breathing in the faint scent of lavender sachets stored in the cedar chest. Yet on the day when her heart should have been full of joy, she found herself hidden, as though the mere sight of her might disrupt the polished image the Fletchers wanted to present. Evelyn Fletcher entered the hall as if she owned the city. The mother of the groom moved gracefully from table to table, diamonds flashing like warning signals with every flick of her hand. Her dress shimmered, her posture radiated confidence, and her air kisses floated through the crowd like currency exchanged between equals. When her eyes passed over Margaret, there was no pause, no nod, not even the briefest recognition that the bride's mother existed. Margaret could have been part of the wallpaper, or a shadow cast by the chandelier. The slight was small in action, yet enormous in weight, pressing on her chest with an ache that Harold would have recognized instantly. Margaret lifted her glass of water, her hand trembling slightly. Not from age, though arthritis made her joints stiff on damp mornings, but from the simmering humiliation of being erased in a room that should have celebrated her presence. She had raised Claire alone after Harold's passing. She had worked through loneliness, financial strain, and the silent nights when the house felt cavernous. And now, when the daughter she had carried, loved, and defended walked into a new life, Margaret was hidden like an inconvenient memory. She leaned slightly to the left, peering through a gap in the flowers, and caught sight of Claire spinning across the dance floor with her new husband, Andrew. Claire glowed, the lace gown catching the light with every step. Margaret's throat tightened with a bittersweet mixture of pride and grief. She wanted to be near her daughter, to hold her hand, to whisper the words that Harold never lived to say. Instead, she sat among strangers, half forgotten, the music muffled by roses. Andrew Fletcher detached himself from the circle of well-wishers and approached her table. His smile was brilliant, polished, almost too precise. He bent slightly, as though his presence at her corner seat was an act of charity. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said warmly, "isn't this just perfect? The church, the music, the whole day. You must be overwhelmed with joy." Margaret studied him, the sharpness of his tuxedo, the gleam of his cufflinks. There was a practiced ease in his voice, a note too slick to be sincere. "I am joyful," she replied, her voice steady though her lips curled with irony. "Although my view is somewhat obstructed." She tapped the edge of the massive bouquet with a fingertip. Andrew chuckled as if she had told a harmless joke. His eyes, however, darted for a fraction of a second, calculating. "We will make sure you get a better seat next time," he said lightly. "But I was hoping we might talk more privately soon. Perhaps dinner, just the two of us. I have some ideas about how our families can collaborate for the future." The words hung in the air like perfume that lingers too long. Collaboration. Future. They were vague, heavy, suggestive. Margaret tilted her head, allowing herself a small smile that revealed nothing of her unease. "How thoughtful," she said softly. "I do love a mystery dinner." He straightened, satisfied, and returned to the center of the hall, where the important guests clustered like jewels on display. Margaret's smile faded as soon as his back was turned. She looked again through the flowers and saw Evelyn raise her glass in triumph, basking in attention. She saw Claire glowing with the innocence of someone who believed the world was exactly as it appeared. Margaret reached for her necklace, the modest strand of pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. She rolled one cool bead between her fingers and steadied her breathing. Inside, a storm was building, quiet but unstoppable. She thought of Harold, of his steady voice reminding her never to underestimate her own strength. At that moment, the truth struck with clarity. This was not her day. It was Claire's. Yet the bitter sting came from realizing she was not even considered part of the picture. She was the silent figure tucked behind flowers, the widow too modest to matter, the mother erased from her daughter's shining story. Margaret Whitfield sat perfectly still, her eyes on the lace gown gliding across the floor. She smiled faintly, but in her heart a decision formed. If they thought she was invisible, they were about to learn how dangerous invisibility could be. The restaurant sat on a narrow Boston street lined with wrought iron lamps and cobblestones that gleamed in the drizzle. Its windows glowed amber in the night, casting warm halos that promised elegance inside. Margaret paused at the entrance, adjusting the collar of her gray wool coat. Her reflection in the glass door looked smaller than she felt inside. She reminded herself that she had lived through darker nights and lonelier dinners. This evening, she would not be the one trembling. Inside, the air carried the scent of garlic sizzling in butter, blended with wine so rich it made her stomach tighten. Waiters glided past like dancers in black uniforms, their shoes whispering against polished wood. The dining room glittered with golden chandeliers, silver cutlery, and conversations layered on top of one another like music without a conductor. Andrew rose from his seat the instant he saw her. His charm filled the space before his words even reached her. "Mrs. Whitfield," he exclaimed with practiced warmth, "you look radiant tonight." Margaret let him pull out her chair. She lowered herself slowly, the pearls at her throat catching the glow of the candles. "Radiant," she repeated softly, savoring the word as if testing its weight. "That is very kind of you." The table was already set with a bottle of wine he had chosen. He poured generously, swirling his glass like a man accustomed to displaying taste. Margaret wrapped her fingers around the stem but did not drink. She studied his reflection in the curved glass, noting the calculation in his eyes. They spoke first of Claire, of the honeymoon plans, of how beautiful the ceremony had been. Andrew's compliments came easily, each phrase polished to shine. Then his tone shifted, subtle but clear. "You must find the house difficult to manage on your own," he said, cutting into his steak with deliberate precision. "All those rooms, all those decisions, the constant upkeep." Margaret placed her fork down gently. "It has been my home for nearly 50 years, she said. "I know every creak in the floor, every crack in the plaster. I think I manage well enough." "Of course," Andrew agreed quickly, smiling as if she had misunderstood him. But surely it can be overwhelming at times, and then there are the financial details, investments, legal issues. It can be quite a burden. Margaret tilted her head, pretending to consider his words. A burden, she echoed. How thoughtful of you to worry about me. He reached for his leather briefcase resting by the chair. The click of the metal clasp echoed like a gunshot in the quiet around their table. He pulled out a folder, thick with documents, and slid it across the white linen tablecloth toward her. These, he explained with a voice dripping concern, are standard protections: power of attorney, financial oversight, medical decision-making, safeguards, really. Nothing complicated. It would give Claire and me the ability to protect you, to make sure no one takes advantage of your generous spirit. Margaret laid her hand on the folder, feeling the crisp edge of the paper beneath her palm. She did not open it. Instead, she raised her eyes and met his gaze with a calmness that made him blink. How considerate, she said softly. You seem to have thought of everything. Andrew leaned forward slightly. It is best to arrange these matters before any complications arise. The longer one waits, the more questions people might ask about one's ability to make decisions. There it was, the knife hidden inside the polite words, a suggestion that her mind might falter, that she could be declared incapable. Margaret's pulse steadied. She had expected this moment, but hearing it aloud was different, heavier. She tapped the corner of the folder twice with her finger. Such efficiency, she murmured. Then she lifted her eyes, her smile small and deliberate. Tell me, Andrew, did you bring your notary along as well? The question fell between them like a stone dropped into still water. His confident expression flickered. For the briefest second, his smile cracked, the mask slipping to reveal surprise. He covered it quickly with a laugh, but it was too late. Margaret had seen the pause, the shadow of calculation rearranging itself in his mind. A notary? He repeated, his tone lighter than his eyes. Well, of course not. That would have been presumptuous. Margaret leaned back in her chair, finally lifting her wine glass. She took a small sip, the flavor sharp and lingering. Yes, she said quietly. Presumptuous indeed. Silence pressed between them for several breaths, filled only by the clinking of silverware from neighboring tables. Margaret let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Andrew shifted in his seat, cleared his throat, and reached for his glass. Inside, Margaret's thoughts sharpened like glass under pressure. He had revealed himself too quickly, too boldly. The documents were not about care or protection. They were about control. And he believed she would surrender simply because she looked fragile behind pearls and gray dresses. Margaret allowed a gentle smile to return to her lips. This has been most enlightening, she said. I must thank you for your concern. Andrew relaxed slightly, misreading her tone. He lifted his glass in a toast. To family, he said. Margaret touched her glass to his, the crystal ringing faintly. Her voice was soft, almost tender. To family, she echoed. But in her mind, another vow was forming. Tonight, behind the candlelight and the false courtesy, a new battle line had been drawn. Andrew Fletcher thought he was circling prey. He had no idea that the woman across from him was already setting the trap. The clock in Margaret's hallway ticked with the uneven rhythm of something old and weary. She had wound it the night before, deliberately, so its faint sound would echo through the silence when Andrew arrived. A fire burned low in the hearth, casting long shadows across the living room walls. The air smelled faintly of Harold's pipe tobacco, though he had been gone for years. Margaret sometimes kept a pouch tucked in the drawer just to keep that memory alive. On the coffee table, she arranged 3 objects with deliberate care. A porcelain teacup with a faint crack along its rim, her grandmother's pearl earrings resting in their velvet box, and Harold's broken wristwatch. The watch was stopped at 4:17, the exact minute Harold's heart had stopped in the hospital. To any guest, it might seem like a sentimental display. To Margaret, it was a reminder that time could end suddenly and without warning. She wanted Andrew to see it. She wanted him to feel the weight of permanence. Hidden beneath the lace doily, a small digital recorder blinked silently. She had tested it twice, checked the batteries, and angled it toward the sofa where Andrew would sit. Tonight was not dinner. Tonight was strategy. When the doorbell rang, Margaret smoothed the front of her gray dress and opened the door with a serene smile. Andrew stood on her porch, his coat immaculate, his hair carefully styled, his expression warm. He carried a leather briefcase, just as before. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, almost cheerfully, "thank you for welcoming me into your home." "Of course," Margaret replied. "Do come in. It is good to talk in a quieter setting." He stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking against the wooden floor. His eyes scanned the room, lingering briefly on the watch, the pearls, the teacup. She saw him cataloging everything, evaluating, weighing. He settled onto the sofa with practiced ease, spreading papers across the coffee table. "I thought we might review some examples tonight," he began, his tone honeyed. "Other families who benefited from protective arrangements like the ones we discussed. You will see how reassuring it can be." Margaret lowered herself into the chair opposite him, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Before we speak of other families," she said softly, "I would like to know more about yours." Andrew's smile held for a beat, then stiffened slightly. "My family?" "Yes," Margaret said. "Where you worked before, your successes, your challenges." He chuckled politely. "Well, I have extensive experience in finance, investments, management, that sort of thing." "How specific," Margaret murmured. She leaned forward, her eyes steady on his face. "Tell me, Andrew, how long have you been managing elderly people's finances?" He shifted, his hand brushing the papers. "I would not call it managing, more like guiding, helping." "How many elderly widows have you helped?" she pressed. Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were sharp. He paused, just long enough for the silence to grow noticeable. "A few," he admitted finally. "Families who asked you to? Families who needed guidance," he corrected quickly. Margaret touched the broken watch with her fingertip, the metal cool against her skin. "Guidance they requested or guidance you suggested?" The tick of the hallway clock grew louder, like a metronome marking his hesitation. Andrew's practiced mask flickered. He lifted his glass of water, sipping slowly, buying time. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said carefully, "I think you may be misunderstanding my intentions." "I do not misunderstand," Margaret said, her voice low but steady. "I understand perfectly. I understand debts, gambling debts, the kind that make a young man desperate enough to marry quickly, to charm easily, to pressure an old woman into signing away her independence." For the first time, his smile faltered completely. His hand froze midway through setting down his glass. His eyes darted to the watch, then back to her face. "How do you know about that?" he whispered. Margaret leaned back, the firelight glinting off her pearls. "I know everything I need to," she said, "including the fact that you are not the first smooth-talking man who tried to separate me from what Harold built. The difference is, this time, I am prepared." Andrew's jaw tightened. He tried to recover his composure, but his voice betrayed the strain. "You are making very serious accusations." "I am making observations," Margaret corrected. She reached under the doily and lifted the small recorder, its red light blinking steadily. She placed it beside Harold's watch. Andrew stared at it, his breath catching, his face drained of color, the mask stripped away in an instant. "You are recording this?" "Yes," Margaret said calmly. "Every word, every smile, every suggestion." He opened his mouth, then closed it, his eyes flashing with anger and fear. He tried to gather his papers quickly, but his hands trembled. "You cannot prove anything," he hissed. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes sharp as glass. "I can prove enough. Enough to show that the harmless widow you underestimated is not nearly as helpless as you imagined. Now, Andrew, tell me again, who exactly are you trying to protect?" The room fell silent, except for the relentless ticking of the hallway clock. In that silence, Andrew Fletcher's carefully constructed image collapsed. And Margaret Whitfield, seated before the fire with Harold's broken watch at her side, knew she had drawn first blood in a game he thought he controlled. The basement smelled of damp stone and memory. Margaret descended the narrow wooden stairs slowly, one hand brushing the wall as if steadying herself against ghosts. Each step groaned under her weight, echoing into the quiet like reluctant confessions. She had not set foot here in nearly 2 years, not since Harold's funeral. The air was thick with dust, with the scent of old paper, and with the lingering musk of Harold's wool coat still hanging limply in the corner. She paused at the bottom, her breath catching. The faintest whiff of Harold's cologne still clung to the fabric, sharp and comforting, a fragrance that reached across time and pressed her heart like a hand. For a moment she closed her eyes, and grief rose in her throat with the same rawness as the day she lost him. But grief was not why she was here. She was here for answers, for the truth Harold had kept hidden. Against the far wall, beneath a shelf of yellowing ledgers and rusted tools, Margaret saw the faint outline of a panel she had never noticed before. Her fingertips traced the seam, feeling the roughness of concrete, until she found the tiny indentation at its edge. A disguised latch. Harold, ever the meticulous planner, had built secrets into the bones of this house. With a push, the panel gave way, revealing a metal safe embedded into the wall. Its surface was cold and mottled with dust. Margaret brushed it with the sleeve of her dress, her heart pounding. She retrieved the small brass key from her pocket, the one Harold had slipped into her palm the night before he was taken to the hospital. He had said only, "Keep it safe. Someday you will know why." She had kept it on her nightstand, too afraid to use it, too consumed by loss to wonder. Until now. The lock clicked open with a hollow finality. Margaret swung the heavy door wide, and the scent that met her was a blend of old leather, paper ink, and Harold's presence, as if he had been waiting here all along. Inside were neatly stacked binders, envelopes sealed with wax, and a leather folio stamped with Harold's initials. Margaret lifted the top binder, coughing as dust rose into the air. Her hands trembled as she flipped through its contents. Bank account statements with balances that dwarfed anything she imagined, investment records stretching back decades, certificates for funds she had never heard of. At the very bottom lay a single envelope, yellowed with time, addressed in Harold's unmistakable handwriting. For Margaret, when the time is right. Her fingers shook as she tore it open. The letter inside carried his scent, as if the ink itself held his cologne. She read slowly, each word cutting through the silence like a blade. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, it means life has moved on without me. I am sorry for the secrets. I lived simply so we could remain safe, but behind that simplicity, I built something to protect you. I left you $35 million, secured and guarded in a trust that cannot be broken. It is not meant for luxury, it is meant for war. If someone ever threatens your freedom, your dignity, or what we built together, this money is your weapon. Use it without fear. I hid it because I knew predators would come. They always come. Promise me you will not surrender. Promise me you will fight. With all my love, Harold. Margaret pressed the letter against her chest, her tears falling silently onto the paper. For 2 years, she had lived with loneliness, convinced she had been left with little but memories. Now she saw the truth. Harold had left her an arsenal, not just of money, but of foresight, of faith in her strength. Her grief bent her forward, pulling sobs from her like storms breaking against the shore. She remembered their first apartment with the broken radiator, their years saving every penny, Harold taking extra shifts, the nights he whispered to her that one day they would not just survive but endure. She remembered his steady hand on hers, the look in his eyes when he made promises he always kept, and now here was one more promise, waiting in the darkness of the basement, written for her to find at the moment she needed it most. She sat for a long time on Harold's old wooden chair, the letter trembling in her hands. Her tears slowed, and something else began to stir. A heat, a clarity. She thought of Andrew's polished smile, of Evelyn's cold dismissal, of being hidden behind flowers at her daughter's wedding. She thought of how easily predators assumed she was weak, invisible, irrelevant. Margaret lifted her eyes to the shadowed beams above, her grief transforming into steel. The trembling in her hands stopped. She folded Harold's letter carefully, pressing it back into its envelope, and placed it in her lap like a crown. In the flickering light of the basement bulb, her reflection glimmered faintly in the steel of the safe door. The eyes that looked back at her were no longer clouded by sorrow. They were sharp, unwavering, alive with purpose. Margaret Whitfield rose from Harold's chair with the letter clutched firmly. The time of mourning was over. The time of battle had begun. The law office was nothing like Margaret expected. She had imagined dark mahogany furniture and rows of dusty law books, the kind of place where men in stiff collars talked down to women in hushed tones. Instead, Delgado Associates was bright and modern, filled with sunlight from tall windows and walls painted in warm cream. Framed photographs of families hung alongside certificates of trial victories. The air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and lemon polish. Behind a wide desk sat Ruth Delgado, a woman in her mid-50s with sharp eyes and the kind of presence that made the room feel smaller. Her dark hair was pulled into a neat bun, and a pair of glasses rested halfway down her nose. She stood as Margaret entered, her handshake firm enough to crack walnuts. "Mrs. Whitfield," Ruth said warmly, "I have been waiting to meet you. Please, sit." Margaret lowered herself into the chair, setting Harold's envelope and the stack of trust documents on the desk. She smoothed her skirt and tried to keep her breathing even. "My husband left me something," she said quietly. "Not just money. Instructions. Protection." Ruth opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages with practiced speed. She nodded once, twice, then leaned back in her chair. "Impressive, very impressive. Your husband knew what he was doing. These are airtight protections, irrevocable trust, complex structures. He left you not just money, but a fortress." Margaret let out a breath she had been holding. "So it is real, all of it." "Very real," Ruth confirmed, "and very dangerous for the people who will try to take it from you." A knock at the door interrupted them. Ruth gestured, and her assistant guided in an elderly woman with a cane. Her back was slightly bent, but her eyes carried the fire of someone who had not yet surrendered. "Mrs. Whitfield, this is Mrs. Ramirez," Ruth said. "She lives 2 streets from you, actually. She asked to sit in on today's meeting because her story might help you." Margaret turned to the woman and offered a gentle smile. "It is good to meet you." Mrs. Ramirez lowered herself into the chair with effort. Her voice was raspy, weathered by age and struggle. "I lost my house last year. Signed papers I did not understand. They told me it was just refinancing. By the time I realized I had nothing, they sold it out from under me." Margaret's stomach clenched. "And no one helped you?" "Ruth tried," Mrs. Ramirez said, her eyes glistening. "But the men behind it were clever. Shell companies, false signatures, endless appeals. I am living with my daughter now, but it is not the same. My garden is gone. My kitchen, the place where I raised my children." The room fell silent. Margaret's hands tightened on Harold's letter. She looked at the neat handwriting, the words urging her to fight. She realized that Harold had known. Not just about Andrew, not just about her, but about all the invisible battles fought in quiet homes across the city. "This is not about me," Margaret whispered, almost to herself. "This is about us. About all of us." Ruth leaned forward, her expression fierce. "Exactly. Elder fraud is one of the fastest-growing crimes in the country. Predators look for widows, pensioners, anyone living alone. They use charm, fear, and manipulation. They steal homes, savings, dignity, and most victims never recover." Mrs. Ramirez nodded slowly. "They think we are weak, that we cannot fight back." Margaret lifted her chin. Her voice, though soft, carried the edge of steel. "Then they have never met me. They thought I was invisible at my daughter's wedding. They thought I was helpless in my own home, but they were wrong. Harold gave me 35 million reasons to fight back." and I will not fight alone." The atmosphere in the room shifted, as though the walls themselves absorbed her words. Ruth closed the folder and clasped her hands together. "Then we start here. We build a case against Andrew Fletcher. We gather evidence. We link him to others. And when we strike, we do not just protect you, Margaret. We protect every Mrs. Ramirez out there." Margaret glanced at the older woman beside her, at the grief etched into her wrinkles. She felt the weight of Harold's watch in her handbag, the stopped hands frozen at 4:17. For the first time since she opened the safe, she understood. This was not just her war. It was a war for every elderly person treated like a shadow. Her grief did not vanish, but it transformed. The sorrow in her chest hardened into resolve. She met Ruth's eyes and nodded once. "Then let us begin." The three women sat together in that sunlit office, strangers no longer. A widow, a survivor, and a lawyer forged into an alliance. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious. Inside, a battle line had been drawn. Margaret spent the entire weekend rehearsing. She practiced the tremble in her voice, the hesitant way her hand would hover above a signature, the soft sigh of someone tired of responsibility. She played the part of the fragile widow until the mirror in her bedroom almost believed her, yet inside, her resolve was sharper than any blade. Her living room became a stage. Ruth arranged small hidden cameras behind the bookshelf, inside the clock, and even tucked into the flower vase by the window. Microphones were slipped under cushions and inside the lampshade. To anyone stepping into the room, it looked as ordinary as ever. Floral curtains, Harold's watch on the mantel, the faint scent of lavender polish. But to Margaret, it was an arena. Monday afternoon arrived with a dull gray sky pressing against the windows. Margaret set a tray of tea on the table, porcelain cups rattling faintly on their saucers. Her hands were steady, though she allowed them to shake slightly for effect. She wore her grandmother's pearls again, the ones Andrew had admired before, a reminder that she was both vulnerable and dignified. The doorbell chimed. Margaret opened it to find Andrew on the porch, his smile wide and his briefcase in hand. Beside him stood a notary public, a thin man with a mustache and a stack of official stamps. Andrew's tone was smooth, practiced. "Mrs. Whitfield, thank you for seeing us. Today we will take care of everything. No more worries for you." Margaret nodded slowly. "Yes, dear. I do get so confused sometimes. Best to let younger people handle these things." Andrew beamed. He guided her to the sofa like a shepherd leading sheep to the pen. The notary sat stiffly at the edge of a chair, pulling papers from his leather case. Andrew spread the documents across Margaret's coffee table with a flourish, as though presenting a gift. "Just signatures, nothing more," he said. "This will give Claire and me the ability to protect your interests, financial, medical, legal. You will never have to worry again." Margaret picked up the pen with careful slowness. Her hand hovered above the page. She glanced at the neat lines, the legal language swimming before her eyes. The cameras recorded every detail, every slick phrase Andrew used to pressure her. "Do not think too much about it," he urged gently. "It is all standard. The sooner we finish, the safer you will be." Her eyes flicked to the notary. He looked mildly uncomfortable, but said nothing. Andrew leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Please, sign, quickly, before complications arise." Margaret's heart pounded, not with fear, but with anticipation. She signed the first page, her signature neat but deliberate. Andrew's relief was visible, his posture loosening, his smile widening. "Yes, that is perfect," he said. "Now the next page, and the next." It will all be over in moments. She signed the second, then the third, letting her hand shake slightly as if exhaustion weighed on her. Andrew's eagerness betrayed him. His breathing quickened, his eyes glittered with hunger. Finally, Margaret paused at the final page. The pen rested on the line, the ink poised to mark her surrender. Silence filled the room, broken only by the ticking of Harold's old watch. Margaret lifted her gaze slowly, fixing Andrew with eyes that no longer wavered. Her voice was calm, almost serene. "Andrew Fletcher," she said, her words cutting through the stillness. "You are under arrest." For a heartbeat, he froze. Confusion flickered, then panic. "What?" Before he could finish, the front door burst open. Officers stepped into the room, their badges glinting, their commands sharp. "Hands where we can see them." Andrew stumbled backward, his briefcase slipping from his hand, papers scattering across the carpet like fallen leaves. The notary bolted upright, stammering, I did not know." Margaret laid the pen gently on the table, her expression steady. She folded her hands in her lap and watched as Andrew's face drained of color. The mask of charm was gone. All that remained was desperation and fury. As the officers cuffed his wrists, Andrew's voice cracked. "You tricked me. You set me up." Margaret's lips curved in a faint smile. "No, Andrew. You revealed yourself. I only made sure the world was watching." The cameras blinked quietly, capturing the image of a predator finally exposed. The police gathered the scattered documents as evidence, while Andrew shouted his innocence, his words tangled in rage and disbelief. Margaret remained silent, her back straight, her pearls glowing faintly in the firelight. The room smelled of fear now, sharp and bitter, layered over the lavender polish. Margaret inhaled deeply. For the first time in years, the house felt like hers again. As Andrew was led away, Margaret glanced at Harold's broken watch on the mantel. Its hands were still frozen at 4:17. Yet tonight, time seemed to move again, carrying her from grief into battle, from invisibility into power. She turned toward the camera hidden in the clock, her voice gentle but clear. "If you have ever felt pressured to sign papers you did not understand, or if someone pushed you to give away control of your life, speak out, share your story. Your voice may protect someone else. Your courage may save another widow, another neighbor, another life." The words hung in the air, a call not just for herself, but for a community that needed to wake up. Margaret knew this was only the beginning. Andrew was just one link in a chain. The fight ahead would be larger, darker, more dangerous. But she was no longer the woman hidden behind flowers. She was the woman with Harold's letter in her hand, with 35 million reasons to fight, and with a growing army of allies ready to stand beside her. The morning after Andrew's arrest, Margaret's house was quieter than it had been in years. No footsteps upstairs, no chatter from Claire, no presence of Harold humming in the garden. Only the hollow ticking of the clock on the mantel, steady and cold. Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea growing lukewarm in her hands. She knew this silence would not last. The storm was coming, and it would come in the shape of her daughter. By late afternoon, the storm arrived. Claire burst through the front door without knocking, her face blotched from crying, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. Her wedding ring caught the light, though it looked heavy on her finger now, more like a shackle than a promise. "Mom," she cried, slamming the door behind her. "What have you done? They arrested Andrew." "He called me from the station. He said you set him up. He said you twisted everything to make him look guilty." Margaret rose slowly, smoothing the lines of her dress. "Sit down, Claire." "I will not sit down," Claire shouted, her voice breaking. "You humiliated him. At our wedding you barely smiled, and now this. He was only trying to help you. He wanted to protect you, to make sure you were safe. He is my husband, Mom. Do you understand that? He is my family now." Margaret's heart clenched at the word. Family. She had carried Claire for 9 months, raised her through scraped knees and broken hearts, and now here she was, standing between her mother and a man who had planned to strip her of everything. Margaret inhaled slowly, forcing calm into her voice. "Claire," she said, "your husband was not protecting me. He was preparing to rob me." "That is not true," Claire sobbed, pressing her fists against her eyes. "He told me you were confused about money, that you were vulnerable. He said he wanted to take the burden from you. He loves me. He loves us." Margaret walked to the mantel and picked up the small recorder she had placed there deliberately. She set it on the table between them and pressed play. The living room filled with Andrew's voice, smooth and calculating. "Do not think too much about it. It is all standard. The sooner we finish, the safer you will be." Claire froze. The recording continued. Sign quickly, before complications arise. These matters work best when handled efficiently. Margaret watched her daughter's face pale as the words played on, each sentence sliced through the illusion Andrew had woven around her. Then came Margaret's voice, steady and clear. "Tell me, Andrew, did you bring your notary along as well?" And Andrew's startled pause, the crack in his mask, the panic in his tone. The recording ended. Silence pressed down on the room. Claire's hands trembled as she reached for the device, then pulled back as though it burned. Her voice faltered. He said it was just paperwork to help." Margaret leaned forward, her eyes sharp but not unkind. "Claire, listen to me. He was trying to take everything Harold left us. He would have had control over my accounts, my health decisions, my life. And when I was gone, all of it would have been his. That is not help. That is theft disguised as love." Claire's tears spilled freely now, dripping onto the table. She shook her head as if trying to push away the truth. "But he is my husband. I stood before God and promised. How could I have been so blind?" Margaret reached across the table and took her daughter's hand, holding it firmly. "Because he is very good at what he does. Men like Andrew study trust the way others study books. They know how to look you in the eye and make you believe lies. That does not make you weak. It makes you human." For a long time, Claire said nothing. Her shoulders shook as she fought the war inside her. Loyalty against truth, love against betrayal. Margaret stayed quiet, letting her daughter's silence stretch until it became unbearable. Finally, Claire lifted her head. Her eyes were red, but her voice, though broken, carried a new edge. "I cannot stay with him. Not after this. I will file for divorce." Margaret's breath caught. Relief and sorrow mingled in her chest. "Are you sure?" Claire nodded, the gesture small but resolute. "He lied to me. He lied to you. He married me to get to you. That is not love. That is predation. I will not live my life as his cover story." Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand tighter. "Then you are braver than you know." Claire collapsed against her mother's shoulder, sobbing like a child again. Margaret wrapped her arms around her, stroking her hair. She remembered holding Claire after nightmares, whispering that everything would be all right. Now the roles had shifted. Claire was the one who needed protecting, not from shadows under her bed, but from the man she had trusted with her life. The clock ticked on. Outside, the evening light dimmed, and the first stars appeared over Boston. Inside, Margaret and Claire sat together, the bond between them reforged in fire and betrayal. Margaret whispered softly, almost to herself but loud enough for Claire to hear. "Andrew thought he could turn us against each other. Instead, he gave us a reason to stand together." Claire clung to her mother's hand and nodded through her tears. "I will stand with you, Mom. Always." The room, once heavy with grief, felt lighter, though the battle ahead remained. Margaret knew Andrew was only one thread in a larger web, but now she had her daughter back, and that, more than money or strategy, gave her strength. The courthouse smelled faintly of coffee and paper, the kind of place where lives were quietly dismantled or rebuilt with the stroke of a pen. Margaret had never imagined herself walking these halls as anything other than a spectator. Yet here she was, summoned not as a victim, but as the key witness to something larger than her own story. Prosecutor Daniel Cho, a sharp-eyed man in his early 40s, greeted her with a firm handshake and a stack of files that looked heavier than bricks. His voice carried both authority and quiet urgency. "Mrs. Whitfield, your case has given us a crack in the wall," he said, ushering her into his office. "Andrew Fletcher isn't just a greedy son-in-law. He is part of a network. We've traced financial documents that connect him to individuals in 3 other states. Shell companies, fake trusts, fraudulent notaries. We're not talking about one man anymore. We're talking about an organized ring targeting the elderly nationwide." Margaret lowered herself into the chair opposite him, her pearls glinting in the fluorescent light. She felt Harold's letter folded safely in her handbag. $35 million. Use it when you need to fight. The words throbbed in her memory. She realized this was the moment Harold had prepared her for. "What happens next?" she asked softly. Cho spread out the files like a map of deceit. "With your cooperation, we can indict not just Andrew, but dozens of accomplices. This could become the largest elder fraud case in federal history. But we need resources. Victims are scattered, most too ashamed to come forward. Legal costs alone will crush them unless someone stands behind them." Margaret's gaze drifted to the window where Boston's skyline stretched against the evening sky. She thought of Mrs. Ramirez, her home stolen. She thought of Claire, heartbroken yet brave enough to face the truth. She thought of every lonely widow who had ever been told she was helpless. Her grief crystallized into clarity. "I will fund it," she said. Cho blinked. "Excuse me?" "I will use the Whitfield Trust," Margaret replied firmly. "All of it if necessary. $35 million. It is not meant for me to live comfortably. Harold built it so I could fight when predators came. They are here, so we fight." For the first time, Cho's composure cracked. A small smile broke across his face, one of admiration. "Mrs. Whitfield, you just turned this investigation into a movement." Within weeks, the Whitfield Fund for Justice was established. Lawyers volunteered their hours. Social workers joined the cause. Hotlines were set up for elderly victims across the country. Margaret's name appeared quietly in the bylaws, but she refused interviews, preferring to remain the quiet force behind the storm. Still, the press could not resist the story. Cameras crowded the courthouse steps when the indictments were unsealed. The evening news led with a headline that made Margaret's chest tighten with both dread and pride. "Boston Widow Cracks Nationwide Elder Fraud Ring." She watched the broadcast from her living room, Claire sitting beside her. The anchor's voice carried weight. Dozens arrested, millions recovered. The case began with Margaret Whitfield, a 72-year-old widow who refused to be silenced. With the establishment of the Whitfield Fund, legal protections for elderly citizens may change forever. Claire squeezed her mother's hand. "They're calling you a hero." Margaret shook her head slowly. "No, Harold was the hero. I'm just finally using what he left me." But deep inside, she felt something she had not felt since Harold's death. Purpose. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for a nation of forgotten voices. The phone on the side table buzzed with messages. Reporters, neighbors, distant relatives. Margaret ignored them all, focusing instead on the faces of the women she had met through the fund, women like Mrs. Ramirez, women who had lost everything but were finally being heard. Margaret rose, walking to the mantel where Harold's broken watch sat silently at 4:17. She touched it lightly with her fingertips. "We are winning, Harold," she whispered. "Your gift is protecting more than just me. It is protecting thousands." She turned back to Claire, her voice calm yet charged with conviction. "This is only the beginning. They thought widows were easy prey. Now they will learn we can be hunters too." On the evening news, the anchor's closing words lingered in the room. "This case may change the way the nation treats elder fraud forever." Margaret faced the camera in her mind and spoke words meant for every viewer who had ever felt powerless. If you have ever seen someone pressured to sign papers they did not understand, or if you have faced it yourself, share your story. Speak up. Each story can save another. Silence is the predator's greatest ally. Subscribe to our channel to support stories that protect the elderly. The more people know, the fewer victims fall into these traps. The battle had moved from her living room into the world, and Margaret Whitfield, once hidden behind flowers at her daughter's wedding, now stood at the center of a storm that promised justice for countless souls. The courtroom was packed on the day of sentencing. The air buzzed with anticipation, reporters scribbling notes, cameras flashing from behind the glass partition. Margaret sat in the front row, her pearls steady against the black of her dress, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Claire sat beside her, her face pale but resolute, the wedding ring long since removed from her finger. Andrew entered in shackles, dressed in a plain gray suit provided by the state. His once flawless smile was gone, replaced by a tight grimace. He avoided Margaret's eyes, but she could feel his anger radiating across the room like heat from a dying fire. He had lost his charm, his audience, and soon he would lose his freedom. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair tied neatly at the back of her head, reviewed the charges with deliberate clarity. Fraud, coercion, conspiracy, dozens of counts tied to victims across the nation. The words echoed through the room, each one a nail in the coffin Andrew had built for himself. Finally, the sentence was read aloud. Andrew Fletcher, you are hereby sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. You will pay restitution to the victims of your scheme, totaling over $11 million, to be dispersed under the supervision of the court. A collective murmur swept through the crowd. Margaret's chest rose and fell as she exhaled a breath she had held for months. It was not triumph, it was justice, heavy and bittersweet. Andrew turned once, his eyes locking on hers for the briefest moment, filled with rage and something else, fear. Then he was led away, his footsteps swallowed by the shuffle of guards. Dozens of elderly victims sat scattered throughout the gallery, some holding hands, some wiping tears. For them, this verdict meant more than money. It meant recognition, dignity restored, a reminder that their lives mattered. Margaret felt their gratitude pressing against her like a tide. She knew this fight had never been hers alone. Weeks later, Margaret stood at a podium in Washington, D.C. The hall was grand, its high ceilings adorned with flags, the audience filled with advocates, lawmakers, and survivors. Cameras broadcast her words across the nation. She adjusted the microphone, her hands steady, her voice clear. We are told that old age makes us weak, she began. We are told that we should be grateful for scraps, that we are burdens instead of blessings. But today, I stand before you as proof that older adults are not weak. We know how to protect ourselves, and when we stand together, we are stronger than any predator who dares to come for us. Applause rippled through the hall, building into something thunderous. Margaret paused, letting it wash over her. She saw faces in the crowd. Mrs. Ramirez, smiling through tears. Ruth Delgado, standing tall with pride. Daniel Cho, arms crossed, nodding slightly as if to say, "This is only the beginning." Margaret continued, her voice carrying further now. What happened to me is not unique. Every year, millions of seniors are targeted by fraud, but we are not invisible, we are not voiceless, and today, we prove that we can fight back. The Whitfield Fund is only the start. Together, we will build a world where age is not a weakness, but a crown. The audience rose to their feet, applause crashing like waves. Margaret's eyes stung, but she held her head high. She thought of Harold, of his letter hidden in the basement, of his faith in her strength. He had known she could do this. He had known she would not only survive, but lead. When the applause faded, a distinguished senator stepped forward, holding a glass plaque engraved with her name. Margaret Whitfield, he announced, on behalf of the community and the nation, we honor you as a champion in the fight against elder fraud. Your courage has saved lives and inspired change. Margaret accepted the award with both hands, her reflection shining in its surface. She raised it slightly, not as a symbol of her own victory, but as a beacon for everyone watching. I accept this, she said softly into the microphone. Not for myself, but for every widow, every grandfather, every neighbor who has ever been told they do not matter. We matter, and we will never be silent again. The applause roared louder than before. Claire wept openly in the audience, her pride glowing brighter than any jewel Evelyn Fletcher had ever worn. Margaret smiled faintly, her heart swelling with something stronger than grief. From the shadows of invisibility, she had stepped into the light, not as a victim, but as a protector, not as a forgotten widow, but as a symbol of resilience. Margaret Whitfield had become more than a woman wronged. She had become the voice of a generation refusing to fade away. The summer evening was soft and quiet, the kind of night when even the wind seemed to rest. Margaret sat on her porch, the wood beneath her creaking gently, the garden stretching out before her like a memory made real. The air smelled of lilacs blooming near the fence, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once before falling silent again. It was the first night in a long time that felt like peace. On her lap lay a letter written in careful, trembling script. The paper was thin, the ink slightly smudged, but the words were clear. Margaret read it aloud to herself, her voice steady. "Dear Margaret, because of you, I have my house back. More than the bricks and the walls, I have my dignity. For months, I felt invisible, like my story did not matter. Now I know it does. You gave me back not only a home, but also my faith in people. Thank you. With gratitude, Mrs. Ramirez." Margaret folded the letter gently, pressing it to her chest. She closed her eyes for a moment, picturing the older woman standing in her restored garden, hands buried in the soil, eyes filled with quiet pride. That single victory was worth more than all the headlines and all the awards. Claire stepped onto the porch, carrying 2 cups of tea. She placed one in front of her mother and sat down beside her. The glow from the porch light softened her features, making her look younger, almost like the girl who used to curl up in Margaret's lap after a storm. "Mom," Claire whispered, her voice filled with warmth. "I am proud of you." Margaret turned her head slowly, studying her daughter's face. There had been tears, arguments, heartbreak. Yet now, there was only love and respect. She reached out and took Claire's hand, squeezing it gently. "I am proud of you too," she said. "It takes courage to see the truth. You did not just lose a husband, Claire. You found your strength." Silence settled between them, comfortable and alive with unspoken words. Margaret lifted her gaze to the mantel inside the living room where Harold's broken watch still rested. She could almost hear the faint echo of his voice, steady and reassuring. She remembered the moment she discovered his letter in the basement, the words that had transformed her grief into determination. Her eyes lingered on the watch face, the hands frozen at 4:17. She spoke softly, almost to herself, though the night carried her words clearly. "When they think we are weak, that is when we are strongest." Claire leaned her head on her mother's shoulder, and together they sat in the glow of twilight, the garden whispering around them. Margaret felt Harold's presence, not as a ghost, but as a steady pulse of faith woven into the air. After a long pause, Margaret lifted her chin and looked directly into the small camera placed discreetly on the porch railing. It was the same camera her friend Ruth had set up to record her reflections for the community fund. Margaret's eyes, framed by age and experience, burned with clarity. "To anyone watching this," she said, her voice firm but kind, "if you have ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or treated as if you no longer matter, speak up. Tell your story. Share your truth. You are not alone, and you never were. Together, we are stronger than those who would silence us." She let the silence breathe, then continued, her tone softer, almost maternal. "I was hidden behind flowers at my daughter's wedding, erased in plain sight. But now I know invisibility can be a weapon. When they cannot see you coming, you can choose the moment to stand tall. And when you do, you shine brighter than they ever imagined." Claire wiped a tear from her cheek, smiling through it. Margaret turned slightly, addressing the unseen audience with her final words. "Share your own story in the comments below. Every story told is another step toward protecting our community. Together, we will build a circle that no predator can break." The porch light flickered gently, moths circling its glow. Margaret sat back in her chair, the letter from Mrs. Ramirez safe in her pocket, her daughter's hand still entwined with her own. She no longer felt like the widow forgotten behind flowers. She felt like the beginning of something larger, a circle of voices rising together, stronger than any silence. And as the night settled fully around the house, Margaret Whitfield whispered the words that now defined her life. "We are not weak. We are the guardians of each other." The circle had closed. The final chapter had begun. As Margaret's journey comes to a close, we are reminded that her story is not only about betrayal, justice, or even the fortune her husband left behind. At its heart, it is a story about dignity, courage, and the quiet strength that too often goes unnoticed in older adults. Margaret began as a woman hidden behind flowers at her own daughter's wedding, made to feel invisible in the very moment that should have celebrated her. Yet she refused to stay in the shadows. With every decision, she transformed grief into resolve, silence into action, and isolation into a movement that protected not just herself, but thousands of others. Her voice, once ignored, now echoes in courtrooms, community centers, and living rooms across the nation. She has become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that age does not weaken us, but sharpens us. And perhaps most importantly, she has shown that when we share our stories, when we speak out, we not only heal ourselves, but also build bridges for others to cross safely. And now, this is where you come in. Your story matters. Whether you are a grandparent, a caregiver, or someone who has faced moments of being overlooked, your voice can inspire, protect, and guide. We invite you to share your experiences in the comments. Every story, no matter how small it feels, is another thread in the circle of protection we are weaving together. If Margaret's journey has touched you, please give this video a like. Share it with someone who needs encouragement, who may be quietly carrying their own battles. And do not forget to subscribe to Grandma's Final Chapter, so you will be among the first to hear more stories like this, stories that honor the strength, wisdom, and resilience of older generations. Because aging is not about fading away, it is about standing taller, shining brighter, and reminding the world that we are here, we matter, and our final chapters can be the most powerful of all.